we pay for what we value, right? So I want to zoom back just a little bit. And I really think it's important that we don't lose sight of what are we here for? What's our mission? What's our vision? How many folks here have read through some part of the statewide multimodal transportation plan, the SMTP?
Yeah.
We call you all, okay, a couple people. We're a big agency, right? There's a lot of plans, there's a lot of guidance. We're very busy. I have pulled out some things that I think are really important for us to keep in mind because it does set the direction for our agency. And one of those things is we're multimodal, right? Our mission, connecting and serving people through safe, equitable, sustainable transportation system. I left out all, that's also very important. All of those things are important and there's always a balance and there's different trade-offs. But a key takeaway here is we're multimodal. We used to be the Department of Highways. In the 70s, that changed to Department of Transportation. And we're still seeing some remnants of that shift away from we build highways, we maintain, operate highways to we are truly multimodal. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of different types of connections that we need to be making. We also know that in terms of achieving our vision, which includes the health of people, the environment, the economy, all three very important things that sometimes butt heads against each other. That can be really difficult given the context that we're operating in. So in terms of our transportation system, we have a large one. We're the fourth largest transportation system in the US. And even that within Minnesota, we only own and operate about 8% of our road system. So we have a large transportation system. We own and operate just a small part of it in Minnesota when we think about the roads. So that means we also need to do a lot of partnership with locals, right? When we think about the system itself, how people are moving, they don't know we don't drive based on jurisdictional boundaries. We drive based on where we need to go. So that's a lot of infrastructure for us to maintain. We need to be thinking about how we're not only moving people, but also goods. So thinking about, those interactions with freight, our rail system. And what bubbles to the top when you think about the different modes is safety. Sonia's shared some of that information in terms of safety outcomes. We heard yesterday, it's disparate between the modes. In 2021 was the deadliest year in over a decade, especially for people walking and biking. And when we look at context, we see that more in rural than in the metro area for Minnesota. So the other thing is when we're thinking specifically about the vehicle context, we've mentioned vehicle miles traveled, reduction target. That's in the context of carbon pollution. Climate change, we're already seeing impacts of that in terms of heavier, more frequent precipitation events where we have flooding, slopes that are destabilized. We're getting warmer summers. We see that with buckling, the impact of buckling pavement. So a big contributor to climate change is carbon pollution from the cars we drive. We're working as fast as we can on electric vehicle infrastructure, but that can't come fast enough. It's one of the many tools in our toolbox. So we're working on installing electric vehicle charging stations along 94 and 35. That's work that's happening through the office that I'm in. But also, those cars don't meet everyone's needs right now, right? You can only go so far. There's only so much infrastructure available. So what else can we do? So you think about that mode shift. And also vehicles are expensive. Not everyone can afford one. There's kind of sticker shock when we think about, is it really $11,000 a year to own a vehicle? Well, we don't pay for it every time we get into it, right? So it's not like public transit where you're putting the dollars in and you see that transaction happens right away. This is the cost for your ongoing maintenance, your oil changes, your car washes, your insurance, all of those things, your monthly payments. And it's not affordable for everybody. So that's also why the multimodal perspective is really important. And then when we think about who we are designing and maintaining and operating for, one of the things that I think is really important is for us to not forget about the people, right? We use our transportation system. We're designing the infrastructure for people, and those needs are changing over time. We're seeing a lot of growth in our urban areas around the state. So that's, of course, in the urban metro area, 7 County area, but also Rochester, Mankato, I-94 corridor, through Fargo, Moorhead. Our population is aging. A 65 plus population is projected to double by 2030. So there's different travel needs that we'll have to meet. And, one of those is thinking about disability. Sonia talked about, stamina when you're out walking. There's different levels of ability, and we can't make the assumption that everybody can get in a car easily and drive around, and we'll need to rely on other ways to get around. We're also seeing growing population for communities of color. We're getting increasingly diverse. That has different travel needs in terms of what types of destinations are we going to, what are perceptions and realities around safety, how are we designing to meet those needs. And then we like to say that we're one of the healthiest states, which we are in aggregate, but if you start to unpack that data, we have some of the worst health disparities in the nation, especially for chronic diseases. When you look at the numbers for health outcomes related to asthma, diabetes, COPD, things like that. And, all of that really undermines everybody's ability to be healthy, and transportation can play a role in that. So the statewide multimodal transportation plan, or SMTP, because we love our acronyms, takes that vision and mission and provides direction on what does this mean for us. So there's three kind of pillars that the new plan, which came out last year, is designed around. And this is really our North Star, what's expected for our agency. So quality of life, that lines up with the health of the people, thinking about context of place, accessibility. So beyond ADA, that accessibility to get to and what you need to be healthy. Environmental health, thinking about resource use, reducing pollution, how are we compatible in working with natural systems versus against. And economic competitiveness, again, how are we moving goods, providing access to services? How are we doing that in a way that maintains our competitiveness, attracts jobs, and grows the state? New to this year's SMTP are these 6 focus areas. All of this, there's a really great website online. The team worked with a couple artists to illustrate some of this stuff. Aging infrastructure. We know that, we are fiscally constrained and we have a lot of infrastructure to maintain. That's going to be a constant pressure. Those repairs that are needed, and that needs to be balanced against all of these other areas that we're focusing on. So I mentioned climate change. Not only do we need to respond to the challenges that we're facing already and will be increasingly facing, but then also how do we provide those real and reliable, feasible options for mode shift for folks so we can reduce that overall pollution. Economy and employment, again, moving goods and throughout our system safely, efficiently. Equity, Sonia had mentioned yesterday, many of our decisions have left certain groups outside of the decision-making process. We have either inadvertently or advertently created harms, and we know that, and we're reconciling with that. So we have a responsibility to step up and pay attention to who's in our communities, who's traveling along and across and through, and how do we better meet their needs and involve them in the process. Safety, can't hammer that one home long enough. And then, of course, the transportation options piece. So just a couple examples of, there's new performance measures. Again, what do we value? What are we measuring? These are at the agency-wide level, and this is how your work on a day-to-day really bubbles up to communicating and tracking progress for the agency. So on some of these, I went through the SMTP and took some of the newest measures and lined it up to the work that we're doing. So we value safety. We value human life. Alexandria, Mary could probably talk about this one. This one had some great pre and post data in terms of the impact of the Complete Streets project. This was a project that was in 2014. It was initially scoped as a mill and overlay and was ADA work, and ended up including a lot of really great Complete Streets design elements, which are listed out there. There's the narrow 11-foot lanes. I think what's really interesting is that pre-post construction crash data and the traffic volume data, where we saw the reduction in crashes post while seeing an increase in traffic volume. So traffic is moving slower. It's created a safer environment, and that directly relates to what we're measuring in terms of we want to see a decrease in fatalities and serious injuries, those life-changing events. We also value economic opportunity. This can be a little bit harder to measure. There's a lot more things here that we don't have direct control over, unlike the street infrastructure. So I just wanted to share some takeaways from some research. Sometimes we hear, don't take away my parking. It's vital for my business. People who are biking are just going through, they're not adding value. Research has shown time and time again the economic benefits of adding bike lanes. This is a case study in Toronto, and I know sometimes it's hard when case studies are not in our state, but or in the US. But there's many other examples like this, where they replaced and had a pilot project. They installed bike lanes on the street, and they found that monthly spending increased. The number of customers visiting those local businesses increased. The frequency of those visits increased, and they were also able to hold vacancies for those businesses steady. So that's just one particular example, but there's many others that show that there's a positive impact in businesses. Sonia would like to share.
Bike lanes is one thing, but another thing that we've been seeing increase the business and the livelihood in our communities is mountain biking. And Crosby Ironton is a prime example of how they've had some massive in their economy and in their city, the businesses, because of all the bicyclists that go there as a destination and then go into town to spend their money.
Yeah, that's a great local example. And so I know Sonia had showed Conveil. That's all about that tool measuring multimodal accessibility. What can you access on foot or on bike, which is newer for us to measure. That's a new measure in the SMTP. How are we measuring destination access and then taking that information and building it into our project decisions? Economic opportunity. This was a few slides on a specific Minnesota research project that we finished up just a little bit ago. We partnered with some researchers at the University of Minnesota to take a look at complete streets projects in small towns in Minnesota, so populations less than 20,000, and do some analysis in terms of quantitative and then also interviews to understand what were the economic benefits, were there positive impacts for smaller towns that had complete streets versus towns that did not. And we did find that there was a positive and significant effect on property taxes for the cities that did have complete streets projects. And there were 9 cities, at least one per MnDOT district. I think that's an important takeaway and a talking point that can be shared when you're out in communities and people are questioning, how much do we add here for different facilities? There's other ways to measure economic benefits. Property values is another one. That research has been a little bit inconclusive. But, the context that you all are often working in, we have, that dual purpose where, people are wanting to move through, but then also we need to make sure that we're creating an environment where people can stay and move across and visit those businesses. So the economic piece of it, I think, is really important. So as part of that research project, I mentioned they did interviews with locals in each of the 9 cities. And most of the individuals perceived no impact, or they found it hard to disentangle the impact of reconstruction from other factors, or they didn't think that it mattered. But overall, many replied that they saw a direct impact to their local businesses and what they thought would be the future of the city's economy. Some of those quotes, you roll into town and you see that it's set up. It's like people care about being here. It makes you want to stop if you happen to be traveling through, creating a memory. I was just talking to Mary about Pelican Rapids. I had never been there before last year. And there's a current project going on. I'm like, this is a really cute town. And they've got a little river and you can kayak down it. They're working on connecting the bike trail. It's a place I want to take my kids. And because they're making it a place you want to stay, hang out a bit. So that aesthetic improvement, I think, can go a long way, even though we don't like talking about it. We also identified, what are those mechanisms of influence that result because of projects like this that are setting the stage for increased economic impact over time. Changing of business practices. Most of the respondents in the surveys and interviews said that they didn't change their behavior post-construction, but then they pointed to altering some business practices, like setting up sidewalk shops or putting out cafe tables. So it does set the stage when you allow that space and provide it to be more inviting, to change those business practices that invite people in. City practices in Alexandria to celebrate the reconstruction and reopening. They had a wine and art crawl event, and it was so successful. It's something that they've continued. So it does prompt kind of a reinvestment of time in the way we think about that space. And so additional investment to prompting some of those businesses to upgrade their facades, put out planters, things like that. So overall, positive impacts. What we value multimodal connections. Brought that up a couple of times. I've mentioned the multimodal accessibility tool. These next couple slides, maybe I'll have Sonia take over because these were from her and she can probably speak to it better.
All right, so these examples are in St. Cloud. This is Highway 10 and 23. It's an intersection, or it's an interchange. The interchange is also bounded by traffic signals. This was not a simple project either. But there's a whole lot of crossings that look like the image on the right. And there's even more than what you see right here. And part of the issue is, in this case, there happens to be Salvation Army on the right side, the grocery store on the left side. And also there's a significant difference in how the transit operations function. And so a lot of people without a car need to ride transit, need to access to their food. And the easier access points are on the other side of the highway. From a transit perspective, it's a difference of like 45 minutes if the bus were to come to their place versus if they cross the street. And that makes a significant difference in everybody's day. This example is if they are crossing where they are currently crossing, which is where the desire line shows up there, versus if they walk down to the nearest signal, which is about 1.3 miles round trip to get to that. Is that a realistic expectation? Are they going to be doing that? And so, I mean, I have forgotten the numbers, but there was something like 60 crossings on a random day in like October, November timeframe between 1 and 5, which I would argue might not even be that great of a timeframe for that kind of account. But it's a significant number of people trying to cross the street to get to there. There's a few other weirder desire lines in this, like one that goes through the cloverleaf. Where they go is across the cloverleaf, but yeah, this is a significant example of, the expectation is that we hope they'd walk to the signal, but it's too far away. So the time difference is huge.
Yeah, the time difference, you can't see it enough on you, but it goes from 8 minutes to 40 minutes. So which option are you going to pick? I'd probably pick the 8 minutes, which we don't want. So thinking about that multimodal accessibility, finding those destinations, how can people get there? How do you want them to get there? What are the trade-offs, right? These are all things that we can do in our planning and development process. The other thing that we value is public health, improving quality of life, the squishy stuff that sometimes we feel uncomfortable talking about. I would challenge that, I showed yesterday the transportation and public health connections. I would challenge the notion that we only do transportation. We also are public health professionals because that infrastructure makes a significant impact on people's well-being and their ability to access goods and services. So this was a project, I did not work on it, but I was asked to add a quote to the video. If you want to watch it some time, I'm not going to have you do that now. But Dr. Yingling Fan, the researcher who helped us with the initial project I showed yesterday, worked on another project called Can Your Commute Make You Happy? I think most of us think about commute, think about in your car and you're like, well, I wouldn't be happy. I mean, sometimes you can listen to a podcast, it's fun. But this was specific to Minneapolis, St. Paul. They tracked people's emotional experiences on their commute, depending on their commute mode, and they did a transportation happiness map. There's a short video about it. I think this connects really well with some of our SMTP measures around public trust and confidence. Like, does Does MnDOT understand my needs? Do they value me as a person? And then also the multimodal piece. So commute happiness, any guesses on what was the happiest mode of commuting or even where?
Walking.
You say walking? Okay. Oh, is this the happiest? There's so many cars. And this is not West River Parkway, but they did find that West River Parkway was the happiest place for people commuting, and specifically people who were on their bikes. And if you watch the video, so you're close, Dan, but I would say walking along here is pretty nice too. If you watch the short video, they interview people who are biking and walking along the parkway, and they talk about some of the things we talked about on our field walk, our empathy walk. You know, like, yeah, I'm in nature. People like being around nature. You're going slower. You feel protected. The facilities are designed for that mode, and you're outside. So it's just really interesting. I know this is very specific to the urban context, but if we step back and think about this in the context of all that we're doing, how are we creating those moments in those spaces, right? We have that opportunity, especially in small town main streets. And there's many different performance measures that connect to this when we think about physical activity, multimodal, some of the measures around native seed plantings. We're doing a lot of work in that area. So the last thing I just wanted to put forth when we think about what are we measuring, what's driving our decision making. Keep in mind the health of the people, environment, economy, that should be driving our decision making. And we're doing a lot of things across the agency. I showed this silo picture in the back earlier, and talked about, we all play a role, we need to collaborate and make that, siloing kind of disappear. These are some of the things that are in progress or have recently been completed that are happening that support this work, that tie into what we're doing. Some very well established things like towards zero death, some newer things, concerted efforts around transportation equity, the scoping field walks that Sonia and Pamela lead. Then also some newer things. The access management plan is going through an update. Todd Sherman is working on that. Bicycle plan update. Sonia's group has led some really great work around vulnerable road user assessments. And of course, the cost participation policy update. So there's a lot of things happening, a lot of resources to track. And I just would hope that we're all thinking about how does our work tie into all these other things, and it is the direction we're headed. So anything else?
And also, I think, how are these things working together instead of being separate things that now feel like extra?
Yeah, how are we, Steve and I have talked about that. How do we, and that's something we need to get better at in I've heard we're called the Marble Nut House in central office, fair. How do we get better at not coming in and saying, this is what we're doing now, and this is the one thing right here, but coming in to say, this is the challenge we're having. What works for you? How can we work this into the process that you already have and not make it an add-on, but expanding what we're doing, making it better, right? So that is top of mind for me and all the work that I'm doing.
I was gonna echo that. That is something that Nissa and I have talked quite a bit about. How can we align to do X, Y, Z? She says, what are you doing in your work and how can I reflect that in my work? And so we do talk about that all the time and talk about how can we lessen the burden on others so that it doesn't feel like, oh my God, now I have to do this. And that's why we've added in the state system approach discussion into these conversations, because they're not necessarily different. They're all ways to achieve that's overall goal.
Yeah, and so a plug for that transportation scoping field walks. As part of that, Sonia's report that she'll complete at the end of it, she provides the Complete Streets project reporting answers if you choose those things that she's recommended, right? So her and her team, they'll list out like, okay, here's what the context was, here's what the hierarchy was, here are the suggested changes and why, here's the different answers to those reporting questions. So we're trying to figure out all those different touch points and process of ways to support everybody who's doing the implementation and make it easier and more efficient. So if you have ideas on like, how do we not silo these things? How do we make it work better? We're all ears.